that marriage is first and foremost a gift from God and an idea of God. Adam was just there doing the work that God had given him. It is God who noticed the absence of relationship and thought, not good. Let me make him a helper. Maybe he was missing, he sensed he was missing something, but God noticed and said, I'll make him a companion. And God created relationship. God made Eve and brought Eve to Adam. Marriage was God's gift and God's idea, and God presented that to Adam. And in our day and age today, I imagine any child growing up never imagines where they will end up in future. Any person who's married never knew who the spouse was going to be. It is like that process of growing up, with all the things that happen in life. Maybe you end up in that school, in that college, and eventually you meet your spouse somewhere. I always like hearing the stories of how people met. And the one thing that is common to all that is that they could not have brought it about by themselves. And even in our day and age, you see that marriage is God's gift. God brings people together and eventually they end up in marriage. And here's something I thought interesting about Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve encountered God first before they met one another. Adam did all this work for God, and Eve was made by God that by the moment she woke up, the first thing she sees is God. And I don't know how much time they were together by the time he brought Eve to Adam. But what that tells us is they were both grounded and secure in who God made them to be before they stepped into each other's lives. They didn't step into each other's lives to be made complete by the other. They were made fully in God's image, and they stepped there to grow and to continue growing, inspiring one another to bear God's image fully. So that is a good thing even for us. Yeah? As we grow, God brings us together. We have been discovering God's image, and even in marriage, we continue to discover that. And one of the ways that happens is just the very work and practice of loving another person fully. You cannot love another fully and genuinely and remain unchanged. It shakes you to the core. It challenges your selfishness. It grows you in bigger ways. So you continue growing just by stepping into that gift of God called marriage. So that's the first thing that we see. Marriage is God's gift to help us bear God's image fully. Secondly, we see that marriage is a place for receiving the other fully. And that is captured by Adam's response when he wakes up. He says, goodness, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, because out of man she was taken. Yeah, he bursts into song. In other words, he receives this woman fully. He affirms her. He names her. He embraces her fully. So marriage becomes that place also where we learn to receive one another fully. There are very few places in this world where you can hear the words, you are at home in me. I welcome you to my life. I welcome you to my heart. With all your unique strengths and weaknesses, welcome. I receive you. In my own life, in my own marriage, this becomes an everyday task because we are growing, we're discovering each other's unique strengths and weaknesses as well, and we have to intentionally receive one another. So this is a practice we can take for those who are married, to wake up each day and say, I receive you. Just like Adam woke up from that deep sleep, and there's something. It is very difficult to create a space where the other thrives when you begin by sort of changing them, rather than when you begin by first receiving them and allowing those words, you are at home in me, to be true. And then from there, you create a healthy space where they continue to embody God's image fully, because they are human. Sometimes they get on your nerves. They have odd quirks and occasionally say things that do not make sense. And we have to learn to live with each other. So marriage is that place to welcome, to receive, to remind each other of their true worth as God's image bearers and sons and daughters of God. And then number 3, when we look at the first wedding, there's this whole idea of them joining together. And therefore a man leaves his father and his mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. Yeah, there's this idea that ultimately they become one. And it's so interesting that Paul in Ephesians chapter 5 begins to work with that idea as well. In Ephesians 5:28-30, Paul writes, "In the same way, husbands should love their wives as they do their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hates his own body, but he nourishes it and tenderly cares for it, just as Christ does for the child, because we are members of his body. For this reason, a man will leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." And so, marriage as a space of bearing and embodying God's image has this aspect of oneness, this aspect of coming together, this aspect of being joined together so closely, unlike any other space. No wonder we read in Genesis, it concludes with the words that the man and the woman were naked and they felt no shame. You see, when love works more fully, shame is absent. When love works more fully, shame is absent. When there is that oneness, shame and fear are absent. And then marriage becomes that place where that can be cultivated, where people feel the freedom to show up more honestly and with greater openness. Perhaps we can begin to hear or to imagine what those writers meant by the words, "they were naked and felt no shame." And also, something about that, the idea of oneness. Union with God is always the ultimate objective of our faith. We are on this human journey, and the greatest thing that can ever happen to us is union with God. And there are echoes of that throughout Scripture. In Genesis chapter 1 and 2, God lived in perfect union with human beings. They were connecting, they were relating in that Eden space. And Jesus embodied that fully well. Then in Revelations chapter 21, verse 1-5, I'm going to read it for us. And this is what it says. "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from heaven, from God, down out of heaven from God, as prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away.'" Yeah. Scripture begins where God lives in union with humanity, and Scripture concludes the same way. See, the home of God is among mortals. He's dwelling among them. He will be with them. He is with them. And you can see what God has longed throughout life is more and more union. And so, marriage has a way of reminding us of that ultimate purpose. When man and woman become one, when they continue being more and more one, it reminds us of that ultimate purpose, even from God. It's interesting that even a wedding image is being used. The city of God comes down like a bride adorned for her husband. So, these are the things we are saying. Marriage is a gift from God. It's God's idea. God makes it happen. God brings people together. God invites people into that journey and sets them on a course of loving one another so that they can bear God's image more fully. Marriage should be a place where we learn to receive each other more fully, celebrating, affirming, reminding one another of their true identity as God's image bearers and God's beloved sons and daughters, and fanning that into flame. And then number 3, marriage is a space where we begin to experience a oneness that reminds us of God's eternal desire to live in unity with humanity. So, for you whom God has called to marriage, for you whom God has given the gift of marriage, do the work of loving and cherishing one another. Tend to your marriage that it's a space where you receive one another, where you celebrate one another, where you grow more and more in love with God. And by you'll experience union with God. And we are having this conversation in the midst of a society that only hears the crisis in marriage. But we are in this space to say that marriages are a big idea to God. If God invites you into that space, invest yourself fully in that. And we know it's not easy. It's hard work. The past 11 years for me have not been all a smooth journey. We have tough times, we have moments we're distant from one another, and we have to keep on working towards being closer and being connected. And we keep journeying forward as time goes by. And so I just wanted to say, it's not an easy journey. It's messy. There's a lot of forgiving. There's a lot of growing up. But above all, you discover how much you need God's help in it. You just can't do it on your own. Yeah. Remember, it's about bearing God's image while you're there. And so I want you to imagine what the world might look like when there are more and more healthy marriages. You can imagine that the children in that family grow up under the safe shelter of a healthy marriage. And above all, you can imagine the people in that marriage thrive and fully engage in this world as God's image bearers. And I came across this quote by an author called Rob Bell. And this is what he says. There's a lot that's broken in the world. A lot that is not one. From war and racism and injustice to abuse and addiction and people taking each other to court and families breaking apart. We live in a broken, fractured, and fragmented world. But when you're faithful to each other, loving as you act for the well-being of the other, just what we are saying, the space between you becomes a place in the universe that isn't broken, divided, but is one and whole. This is why the world needs marriage, more marriages, better marriages. The world needs more places that are one and whole. Great marriages shine and stand out. They inspire, they bring hope, they speak to our deepest desire for a world that is one. And with that, you're invited, you who God has brought into that space, to tend to that space. You who God will invite into that space one day, to step in there knowing there's a bigger agenda. And to know that ultimately, may we continue bearing God's image more fully.